Hi, I'm the History Guy. I have a degree in history and I love history, and if you love history too, this is the channel for you. The world, it seems, enjoys a good Western. Western films were the most popular genre of film from pretty much the beginning of film all the way up through the 1960s. And Western fiction has been popular in a number of different media, from books and comic books to radio and television. And it's a worldwide phenomenon that is as popular, it seems, in Europe and Asia as it is in the country where the stories supposedly occur. But of course, Western fiction only rarely accurately represents life on the American frontier. And so the intersection between fiction and reality offers us good insights both into the consumer of Western fiction and the reality of Western life. And a good example of that is in one of the most popular of the fictional characters of the Wild West and the little-known lawmen who most resemble that character. And it is a story that deserves to be remembered. So return with us now to the thrilling days of yesteryear. From out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of the great horse, Silver. The Lone Ranger first rode into the hearts and minds of listeners courtesy Detroit area radio station WXYZ, with the title role voiced by actor George Seaton, who later won 2 Academy Awards for screenwriting, and said that he invented the famous catchphrase, "Hi-yo, Silver!" because he couldn't whistle. WXYZ aired nearly 3,000 radio episodes of the show featuring a Texas Ranger who fought outlaws, accompanied by his faithful Indian companion, Tonto. According to the story, the Lone Ranger was one of 6 Texas Rangers who were caught in an ambush by the despicable Butch Cavendish gang. Later, a friendly Indian happens upon the scene and finds that one of the Rangers has survived. Tonto buries the dead Rangers, but makes 6 grave markers to hide the fact that one survived. He then nurses the injured Ranger back to health. The Ranger is forced to wear a mask to conceal his identity since he was supposed to have died, as he fights for justice against Butch Cavendish and his gang. The show was a classic Western and was popular partly because of the Ranger's strict moral code, which represented American values at the time and included phrases like, "To have a friend, a man must be one," and "All things change but truth, and that truth alone lives on forever." The Lone Ranger only used silver bullets because they reminded him that life is precious and, like the bullets, shouldn't be wasted. Along with the radio show, the Lone Ranger spurred 2 film serials in the 1930s, a popular television show that ran over 220 episodes between 1949 and 1957, 2 different cartoon series, a newspaper comic strip that ran for more than 30 years, dozens of adventure novels and comic books, a video game, hundreds of various toys, and 7 feature films. And in one of the lesser-known connections, the Lone Ranger spawned a popular spin-off property where, according to the story in the original radio show, the Lone Ranger's young nephew, Dan, who appeared in both the radio show and the television show, has a son who eventually takes on again the role of masked crime fighter as the Green Hornet. But the popularity of the Lone Ranger begs an interesting question. Was there a real Lone Ranger? The answer is possibly. In 1915, novelist Zane Grey wrote a novel called The Lone Star Ranger, which itself was adapted for 4 different feature films. The character in the novel is fictionalized, but the novel was dedicated to a real Texas Ranger named John Reynolds Hughes. While he was a rancher in Travis County, Texas, Hughes had tracked down a group that had stolen horses from his and other ranches. That drew the attention of the Texas Rangers, who recruited him. He served as a ranger for 28 years, the Texas Rangers' longest-serving member. Hughes was known as one of the most effective of the Texas Rangers, and notably, when another Texas Ranger captain was killed in an ambush, Hughes, one of the Rangers' best trackers, relentlessly pursued the gang that had committed the ambush, somewhat like the story told in The Lone Ranger. While Hughes had certainly inspired Zane Grey, who knew and respected Hughes, it's less clear whether he was an inspiration for the Lone Ranger. But he was certainly an example of a dedicated Texas Ranger, and, like the story, had doggedly tracked down outlaws who had killed other Texas Rangers in an ambush. But when talking about the Lone Ranger, there is another story as well, that of lawman Bass Reeves, who was, according to one biographer, the closest real person to resemble the Lone Ranger. Bass Reeves had been born a slave in 1838, and as was common at the time, he had taken the last name of his owner as his own. Sometime in the early 1860s, he'd parted ways with that owner. Some stories say it's because he had a fight with his owner over a card game, and others say that he simply had heard that Lincoln was planning to free the slaves. But for whatever reason, Reeves escaped slavery and went to live in Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma, living among Cherokee, Seminole, and Creek Indians and learning both the territory and many of the people's languages. He became a crack shot with a pistol and a rifle. After the war, when the 13th Amendment passed and he no longer had to fear being returned to slavery, he moved to Arkansas, where he became a successful rancher and had 10 children. Indian Territory was notoriously lawless, and many outlaws fled there to escape justice. In 1875, President Grant appointed a new judge of the U.S. Court for the Western District of Arkansas with the goal of addressing lawlessness in the Indian Territory. The judge then appointed a former Confederate general as the new U.S. Marshal, who then hired 200 deputy U.S. Marshals, some of whom were among the most famous lawmen of the West. Having heard of Reeves' knowledge of the Indian Territory and familiarity with its people, the new marshal hired him as one of those deputies. Bass Reeves became the first black deputy U.S. Marshal west of the Mississippi. He served for nearly 30 years and in that time brought in more than 3,000 wanted outlaws. He survived numerous gunfights, and despite having both his belt and his hat shot off in different gunfights, he never himself took a bullet. He was one of the most feared and respected lawmen of the Indian Territory. He was known for dressing fastidiously and for wearing 2 Colt pistols with the butts faced forward for a quick draw. As was common for many Americans of the time, and certainly former slaves, he had never received a formal education and so never learned to read and write. Before he went on patrols, which could take months at a time, he would have someone read the outstanding warrants to him, which he could recite from memory. At first, Reeves might seem nothing like the Lone Ranger. He wasn't even a Texas Ranger and was never shot, more or less nursed back to health by a faithful Indian companion. But deputies in the Indian Territory would often travel only accompanied by a posse member, who would be a Native American. Although he was most known for riding a red stallion with a white blaze that highly resembled Tonto's horse Scout from the Lone Ranger television series, he was also known to ride a white horse. And while he did not wear a mask, he was known to use disguises when capturing outlaws. It is not hard to see how this dedicated lawman, traveling alone with his Indian companion, catching the bad guys, could be seen as one biographer described him, the closest real person to resemble the Lone Ranger. In the end, there's no real evidence that either Bass Reeves or John Reynolds Hughes inspired the fictional character of the Lone Ranger. The creators of the character actually didn't mention any real lawmen at all. They said the Lone Ranger was inspired by Robin Hood and the actor Tom Mix. But both Reeves and Hughes bore some striking resemblance to the legendary masked ranger, and they show us that the vision of a lone lawman dispensing justice on the wild frontier is not merely a fabrication of the entertainment industry. It is interesting that both Reeves and Hughes had some similar backgrounds. Both as young men had spent substantial time in Indian Territory, where they developed the skills that would serve them later as lawmen. Both had been successful ranchers, which provided them with a vested interest in protecting the people of the frontier from lawlessness. And both had long and distinguished careers as lawmen, part of that special breed of people who bridged the gap between the Wild West and the modern world. And both were most certainly heroes, even though neither one is nearly as well known as the legendary Lone Ranger. Bass Reeves died of kidney disease in 1910 at the age of 71, and John Reynolds Hughes, who was in ill health and depressed over the fact that all his old friends had died, tragically took his own life in 1947. He was 92. But Bass Reeves is a great example of one of the things that Hollywood has largely gotten wrong over the years. To watch the golden age of American westerns, you might have guessed that the frontier was settled only by white cowboys. In fact, an estimated 20 to 25% of the Western cowboys were black, where the independence of the range offered a relative equality, even though they still faced discrimination and were often given the least favorable tasks. It is those true stories of the West that deserve to be remembered. I'm the History Guy, and I hope you enjoyed this edition of my series, 5 Minutes of History, short snippets of forgotten history, 5 to 10 minutes long. And if you did enjoy it, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button, which is there on your left. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to write those in the comment section. I'll be happy to respond. And if you'd like 5 minutes more of forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.